Welcome to The Friend I Wish I Had, the show that was made for listeners everywhere, looking for some company in the uncertainty of this thing called life. You will hear stories of personal events, lived experiences, and resilience. Stories that remind you that you are not alone. When you feel there is no one to talk to, you will find a story to hold on to, like the friend you wish you had. I am your host, Sandy Falcon, and I am honored to be the friend I wish I had. Let's begin. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for episode number 12. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Robbie Seale. Robbie and I met through a podcast group as well, Women in Podcasting on Facebook. And Robbie has her own podcast show. She is the host of a show called FASD Family Life. So today I have Robbie on the show, and she's going to share with us her story and how she got started with FASD Family Life and what FASD means for the people who don't know what it is. I'm so happy and honored to have Robbie with us today. Thank you so much for being with us, Robbie. And I'd like everybody to know why you are the friend they wish they had as well. Robbie?
Thank you, Sandy. That's amazing. Thank you for that really nice intro. My name is Robbie, and I started my podcast, FASD Family Life, to be the friend to people that I wish I had 10 or 12 years ago when I was starting to learn about a developmental disability that was impacting my 4 adopted children. And that developmental disability is Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder. And it's a really complex disability that is really common in Canada and in the US, UK, Australia. And it was a lonely journey to try to learn about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD, and how to best parent my kids. And back then, I was desperately looking for a friend who'd lived this life, who could give me some tips and some pointers. And I never found that friend. So I decided that I would make myself available to be the friend to other parents and foster parents and carers who are, trying to take care of their children who have a developmental disability because of prenatal alcohol exposure. And that was my impetus for starting FASD Family Life podcast.
Wow, that's amazing. And how is it that you came across FASD? What characteristics or behaviors did you see in your children that led you to the diagnosis of FASD?
Sandy, that's a great question. The characteristics of FASD are generally behavioral problems that we see in our children. Most often we notice them once they start school. There may have been sometimes there's some lagging developmental milestones that we see in infancy, or sometimes we see a failure to not sleep well, not eat well. But oftentimes the preschool years with FASD, or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, are kind of the golden years. And it's once children go into school and we're expecting some more self-control for them, and we're expecting some more independence, that's when we start to see, oh, there's some gaps here. There's some things my children struggle with. And then we start to see that perhaps there's some learning disabilities. And then we see some problem behaviors because the kids are impulsive and maybe they're developmentally dysmature, which means in some ways they are at their appropriate developmental level to their age. And in many other ways, especially socially, emotionally, kids with FASD tend to be perhaps half of that chronological age developmentally. So that 7-year-old in school who's expected to be able to sit still during teacher class time, be expected to complete a math page, be expected to remember to bring their backpack to school and their lunch to school, and remember to bring their backpack and lunch home from school. Those things are very difficult, and if not impossible, for a 7-year-old with FASD, because that 7-year-old is developmentally more like a 3 or 4 year old. So there really are some lags, and that's where we start to see, oh, my kid is really struggling. And for me, my children, my twins were 6 years, or let me think about this, 6 years old and in grade one. And in November of grade one, the teacher said to me, your girls are failing. Now, they had previously been in French immersion, and now they were in an English program. So I thought, well, maybe, and I said to the teacher, maybe we're missing some foundational learning that they missed because of their education. Let's go back to kindergarten and build those foundation blocks. And that wasn't possible. So the girls continued to struggle in grade one and fail. So we brought in, my parents stepped in to be able to tutor the girls. We went on to grade two, and they continued to fail, but not just fail, but have anxiety, be very sick before going to school because they were so anxious about school. When in school, they didn't know what to do. So they would be drawing pictures or tearing up paper in their desk because they were completely lost. These are some things that are very common with children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So at that time, my girls were failing in school. I began to investigate, could this be fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? And I thought that because my children, 4 of my children are adopted from the foster care system, and my 4 children had been prenatally exposed to alcohol and trauma and a lot of difficult stress prenatally. And so fetal alcohol spectrum disorder was a real possibility. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a result of prenatal alcohol exposure. And so with that in mind, I began the search of what is FASD? How does it impact children? What are the better strategies? What is a parent to do to best support their kids? So it was about 12 years ago that I really did the deep dive into what is FASD.
Wow, that's an incredible journey that you had to navigate, and not having very much support or resources, and having to research something like this must have been very difficult and isolating, I can imagine. Having 2 children with mild intellectual disability, which was something I had learned about 6 years ago, kind of when I got a psychological assessment from the school, and they said, oh, your son has mild intellectual disability. And I kind of just nodded and said, okay, thank you. I was relieved to have heard a term for what it
Yes.
was that he was suffering from, or what was impeding him from being successful in school. By that time, he was already in the 7th grade. But nevertheless, when I walked out of there, I had absolutely no idea what that meant. I had absolutely no idea what that looked like or what I was going to do from there on. And I had to go on a similar journey of trying to understand and interpret all of this information of, Googling mild intellectual disability and trying to figure out how or where or what to do to support my son as much as possible. So I can imagine what it was like for you not having the same support that I also looked for. Now there's more support for mild intellectual disability on Facebook. I've noticed there's a lot of groups. Do you find that there's groups for FASD on Facebook or out in the web?
Fortunately, yes, there is. I found that's where I started my search too. What is FASD? And I started my search, and back then, that was a long time ago when we're talking about the internet. And there was some, though. I
Mhm.
found a great resource called FASD, FAS Yukon, and I found one called nofasd.org. That's out of the United States. They're now called Proof Alliance. Those were some of the initial ones I found. Now in 2021, there's a tremendous amount of information on the internet about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. There are FASD networks and alliances all over the world now trying to support families raising children with FASD because it's extraordinarily difficult. And children and youth and adults with FASD have a very complex disability that is often only recognizable because of the challenging behaviors they present. Oftentimes people with FASD do not have even a mild intellectual disability, although they may have. This is a spectrum disorder, but frequently individuals with this developmental disability have a typical IQ, but because of damages to their brain, they're not able to access everything they know when they need to use it. And so that's one of the problems with FASD. Fortunately, there are those resources on the internet so you can learn about FASD and you can talk to other parents. Now, some of the groups have online support groups, and there's a lot now of online training that's available. CAN FASD, which is the Canadian Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Resource Network, is a tremendous resource, and CAN FASD is leading the way in the world in understanding fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and research. So I'm so glad to be living in Canada and have that resource right here in my own backyard.
That is very comforting to know that Canada, since you and I are both in Canada, it is nice to hear that Canada is leading in this type of information. So I was wondering for example, would you be able to give us, I guess, sort of like a list of things that parents would look for in their children to prompt them to look for more answers, maybe in FASD, in regards to behavior or age? So, for example, your children were 7 and they were failing. What are some signs that you found, like stepping back, right? And looking back at how your girls were progressing and what was going on? What were some telltale signs that now you recognize that back then you weren't familiar with? Because, like you said, you had no idea. What would parents look for in their children that could possibly lead to investigating if it was FASD?
Sandy, that's an incredibly good question. Thank you for asking that question, because it is a difficult disability. There are so seldom there's any physical markers. There can be physical indicators, but I'm not actually going to go into that because it's only about 7% of people, 7% of people that have FASD that have the physical markers. So they can be distracting. So I'm not even going to talk about that. But there are primary behavioral characteristics of FASD. The first is dysmaturity, which is socially or developmentally younger than their chronological age, like I suggested to you. Lower processing pace, impulsivity and distractibility, memory problems, including inconsistent academic performance, strength in some areas like art, music, interpersonal skills, computer, and others. Often very compassionate with younger children and with animals. Difficulty generalizing or forming links and making associations. Difficulty abstracting and predicting outcomes. And overall, over sensory stimuli, how do I say this? Over and under sensitivity to stimuli. So that is the sensory processing disorders that can be so prevalent. Back to the difficulty abstracting. That means things like many times people with FASD have a very difficult time being able to tell time, understand time, like if it's, let's say it's 4 o'clock. If I say it's 4 o'clock, a person with FASD might say, even in the middle of the day, do you mean 4 o'clock in the daytime or 4 o'clock in the nighttime? So that can be part of it. And so very oftentimes people with FASD have a difficult understanding time. So you might have an adult with FASD who maybe is trying to get to an appointment or get to work, and they know that their appointment, let's say, is at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But because they lack the ability to abstract and to problem solve, they aren't able to go, okay, I have to be there at 2 o'clock. It takes me an hour to get there. So I have to start getting ready, at noon, and then I have to catch the bus at 1, and then I will be there by 2. That's a lot of planning, organizing, some mental gymnastics that people with FASD typically have a really hard time with. And so it's so frequent that people who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, who are maybe have a job, but they can't keep a job because of these kinds of time problems, or perhaps they're getting counseling, but they keep missing their counseling appointments because they have this problem with abstracting what does time mean? And also all of the mental processes of how do I get from home to the appointment on time? So those are some of the struggles. Now, how we see this and now the other thing to consider is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a result of prenatal alcohol exposure. So we need a confirmation from birth mom or those around her that she did drink alcohol during her pregnancy. And with that confirmation, we don't want there to be any stigma. We don't want there to be any blame because we recognize that fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is really a diagnosis for two, because no mother intentionally harms their baby. That's not what this is about. Oftentimes, women are not aware the impact of alcohol can have on their unborn child. And over the years, there's been a lot of misinformation from the medical system and from the social networks around us that say just, a drink or two is okay, or a glass of red wine is okay. And it really isn't. We know now from all the study that's been done about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, we know now that there is no safe amount of alcohol in pregnancy, and there's no safe time at all to consume alcohol in pregnancy. So ideally, from conception through till delivery, there should be no alcohol for mom. Now, we also recognize that that's not always realistic. We know that 60% of pregnancies are unplanned. We know that 80% of women in Canada drink alcohol. So we know that there are women who drink, there are women who do and do not drink alcohol who have unplanned pregnancies. And we know that a woman who does drink alcohol will likely continue her pattern of drinking alcohol or consuming alcohol unless and until she knows she's pregnant. So it's not about fault finding. If we're going to lay fault anywhere, we're going to lay fault with alcohol. Alcohol is the one that does the damage. So that's what families need to be aware of, I think, is what those are the primary behaviors, primary disabilities, where oftentimes what families start to recognize as being a problem are what we call as the secondary behavioral characteristics, because this disability often manifests in really problematic and confounding behaviors like fatigue, really easily frustrated, anxious and fearful behavior from the person with FASD, rigid thinking, very rigid thinking, and resistant and argumentative because they get stuck in their thinking. And perhaps oftentimes there is language processing delays so that the person with FASD has a difficult time understanding fully what is being said to them, and also a difficult time articulating what it is they're trying to say. So they are rigid, resistant, argumentative. A person with FASD would be overwhelmed easily and shut down and maybe demonstrate a flat affect or appear not to care. So these are the kids who look like they have no remorse or they don't give a damn about anything. Well, no, they're overwhelmed until they've shut down. They can't process it. Poor self-confidence, poor self-esteem, feeling like a failure, especially if you're struggling in school, struggling with friends, nothing seems to be going right. Unless you have a diagnosis, you must feel like you're the problem. When you're not, it's that you have a disability. Also, there's a lot there, right? And it can go on and on, like self and aggrandizement. So, like I'm the best and I'm the best at this and I'm the best at that. And yet the adults around can go, really, there's gaps, there's problems. Oftentimes kids with FASD act out, because you'd rather look bad than look stupid. So you act out, right? And you're aggressive too, because kids with FASD very quickly move from a reasonable, an ability to think to an alarm state where it's fight, flight, freeze. And so that's the aggression that like they get overwhelmed and then they explode in rage or explode in frustration. And that's the brain. It's not a character flaw, it's brain. So you can see how this can result in family problems, school problems, maybe suspension or expulsions from school. You can see how this can lead to a lot of problems for people. So it looks like, you got this really bad kid, this really delinquent kid or difficult child. And really, this is a child with a disability, that if the disability was acknowledged, diagnosed, and supported, the child could be on a much better path to success.
Wow, that's incredible. That is so much information, and it's so great that you can share that with so many parents that are probably listening to this, because it is so isolating when you get phone calls from school saying that your child isn't following the rules per se, or following the curriculum. They're falling behind, and you're thinking as a parent, but I'm doing everything right, or you think you're
Yeah.
doing everything right. And it becomes such a frustrating place for a parent, even because we don't understand how, why, when. And even I can imagine for a parent who's adopted, I mean, trying to figure out where this behavior is coming from, what's going on, what happened, and it could just be so overwhelming. One of the questions that keeps coming to my mind, because I'm currently going through this, and I'm sure you are too, your children, well, must be adults now or getting up there in age, is what are these behaviors look like now that you know what it is? So you have the name, and they're transitioning from children into adults. And you as a parent, now that you know what's going on and you're trying to help, but that transition from 17, 18, 19-year old, what does that look like now? How do you feel about this milestone in their lives, and how do they feel? What have your experiences been so far?
Great question, Sandy. So yes, I have 5 children altogether. I've told you a little bit about a couple of them that are have FASD. I have 5 children. The first is my biological daughter, and she's 29, so she's moving along in her adulthood, really well. My next daughter is 25, and she's my first adopted child, and she some of these indicators were there in her childhood and in her early adolescence. But before we got to know for sure if she had FASD, as a 14-year-old, she started to experiment with alcohol, as many teens in Canada do. They begin to experiment with alcohol. Only this child, because of her prenatal alcohol exposure and her family history of addiction, she was quickly swept away into addiction as a 14-year-old. And despite every intervention I could find, and none of which were tailored to FASD, but every intervention I could find, including, addiction treatment centers, moving our house, moving our community. I moved from one community to another in order to change her schools and change her social environment, getting her we did family therapy, we did animal assisted therapy, but that addiction took root. This was a child whose body and brain was exposed prenatally to alcohol. It was alcohol dependent. And so when she introduced alcohol into her body and drugs into her body again, it just activated that dependency that was already there to no fault of her own. And she was swept into addiction. And just after her 15th birthday, she was in homelessness. And that year between 14 and 15, well, it was really less than that. It was really from 14 and a half to 15. It was really less than 6 months that she began to drink till she was on the streets. And so that's often the course of children who are in foster care, adoption, or just foster care, and with this unknown disability. I didn't know she had FASD and this unknown disability, and then introduce alcohol and it just takes over. And she was swept away into addiction and into homelessness for the next 7 years. I hardly ever saw her or heard from her. So that's what can happen also with children. So when you see those street children on the youth, or the street youth, a lot of them, not all of them, but many of them have come from trauma backgrounds. Many of them have come from foster care and adoption and have been caught up in addiction. It doesn't mean they've been kicked out of home necessarily, but they've been caught up in addiction. And in that bravado of youth, they think that life is maybe better on the streets, or at least they can access, their drugs and their alcohol on the streets. And so that's also can be part of the path. It's not inevitable. It's not that every child with FASD does that, but it can be part of it. Now I have my other children so she's now 25 and doing much better, much, much better. Now my other children are 2 16-year-olds, and they were diagnosed when they were 7 years old with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and learning disabilities. And so from that point on, I worked tirelessly to find a school that could accommodate their learning disabilities and would be willing to learn about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder while I was learning about it too. And that together we would curate the right kind of accommodations, the right kind of supports to meet my kids where they're at developmentally, where they are at with their learning disabilities, but also who their strengths are and who they are. And so they could flourish and thrive. And together with the school, we have created a really supportive environment for my kids, and my twins are doing really well. These little girls who are failing grade 1 and grade 2 are currently in 10th grade, and they're getting honors. They have like 90s in their classes. They're doing really, really well while we maintain supports. If my children were in a typical classroom with a typical curriculum, they would not be thriving the way they are. So
Wow.
I think that answers your question.
Mhm.
So, but
Yes,
now
it does.
the cusp of
Mhm.
now moving into adulthood, it's really quite alarming for those of us who have children with developmental disabilities, because the next step is what? Work life or post-secondary education. And
Mhm.
there again, it's taken me years to curate the support within the school system, a particular school, so my kids are supported. And now as they transition into adulthood, they will still need that ongoing support. But it may be me, it may be better if it is not me who helps support them. Like I will still have to be behind the scenes supporting, but maybe it would be better if they had a mentor, a job coach that could help them. But they will forever need accommodations and support, not because they're stupid, they're not, but because they have a brain injury. So we have to build bridges of support so they can be successful in life.
That's incredible. And it is a full-time, nonstop support system that your children need. And I feel the same way about my boys, because the two older ones have mild intellectual disability. And similarly, once he was diagnosed, then I moved hell and high water to figure out how to make sure that he would transition from elementary to high school and that he would be able to complete high school and get all of the supports that he needed in order to be able to graduate. And so my eldest son is 19 now, and that transition from high school to now what was the question of, okay, he's been supported by the school and by myself for these past 4 years, and then he was done. And that was so daunting to me because I thought, oh goodness, what do I do now? And I was similarly in the position of, do I let him go into the world and kind of step back a bit, still always having my hand sort of, you know, at arm's length to be able to continue to support? Or do I just go ahead and continue taking the reins and kind of lead him on this journey of adulthood, right? So there was a lot of crying and a lot of not knowing what step to take forward. And I did look for resources as well. And there are a lot of resources for adults with developmental disabilities. So I did find some support in that regard. But I found that my greatest challenge was allowing him to make his next decision as to what he wanted to do, which was he wanted to go to work, and helping him find the job that would be able to accommodate to his needs and to his strengths. Because, like you had mentioned before, a small percentage of these cases have a physical actual marker, right? Where
Yeah.
in the case of our children, there weren't any. So my son is the average 19-year-old looking, gentleman, and tall and strong, and
Mhm.
but you can't see his lack of where he's lacking, right? So I was able to help him find a position. He found the position through a friend, but luckily I was able to get in contact with the employer and explain what he had, and they were so wonderful in accommodating and helping him achieve, this position. And he's doing very well. He's installing pools right now, so it's very
Wonderful.
promising, and he is very happy. He's proud of himself.
Mhm.
He knows that he can do this job, and he does it very well, I think. But of course, there's always supervision and accommodation for him. Um, my next question is, do your do your girls know about FASD and what it is and how that looks, and can they explain it when they need to other people?
Yes, that's a good question. Yes, they can. And yes, they do know. And I've had, in addition to having children with FASD, I do FASD training for parents, caregivers, and staff. And I get that question a lot, should I tell my child that they have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or I don't want to get my child diagnosed because then they'll have a label. And then a label will be limiting. And in fact, I think knowing what the disability is actually empowerment. Knowledge is power, and it's the power to know where you might need to advocate for yourself, where you need to ask for help. And I think we all need to ask for help, but we all need to know what our limits are, ask for help where that is, but also be given encouragement to try to go beyond if we can. So the short answer is yes, my children do know that they have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Those are big, long words. So when they first were diagnosed and they were failing in school, they knew that, they knew that every spelling test that they got every week, they got maybe 1 correct out of 10 or none correct out of 10. They knew they were struggling. So it was important for them to have a reason why they're struggling. Otherwise, people, when they don't have a diagnosis, if they don't know that they have a mild intellectual disability, or they don't know that they have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, they just feel stupid and they feel like they're weird and that they don't fit in. But then when they can understand that, no, I actually have a disability. This is not my fault. It's not because I'm not trying hard. In fact, I'm trying really, really hard, but my brain works differently. And that's the language I gave my kids. You have a brain injury. So your brain works differently. You can still learn, and I would point out to them all the wonderful ways they have learned. You've learned to walk, you've learned to talk, you've learned to read, you've learned to ride a bike, you've learned to cook. You've learned all these wonderful things. Your brain can learn. Some things are hard for you. You learn differently. That's how we started, the talking, so that we could always openly talk about, having a good brain day and a bad brain day. And we could, explain things in the context of brain, which is really helpful and empowering. And it empowered my kids to be able, if they had a teacher at school who didn't get it, maybe there was a substitute teacher or a new teacher who was laying on expectations that my kids were trying to, but really could not reach. My children could say, I have a brain injury. I can't do this because I have a brain injury. And it wasn't that it was a cop out, but in the same way, I wear glasses, and if you were to take, and I need my glasses, and if you were to take away my glasses and still expect me to read the computer or to drive a car, and I crash because I can't see, and then you yell at me because I crashed my car, well, no, you took away my support. I need my glasses. If I have my glasses, then I can read. If I have my glasses, I can read, I can drive a car safely. It's the same with our kids. They have a brain injury, so we need to accommodate. In the same way I need glasses to accommodate for my bad eyesight, our kids need accommodations because they have a brain injury. And so with them knowing that they have a brain injury, and now the 16-year-olds and even my 13-year-old are able to say, I have FASD that's caused by alcohol prenatally, or, like before I was born. And so they can because they're the ones out in the world, they're the ones at school, I'm not there, they have to be able to speak for themselves, and they'll need to be able to speak for themselves when they go out into the workforce too.
Wow, that is so empowering. I love the way that you explain that because it's so true. Um, Trying to find some sort of comparison to help our children understand what it is, and even I mean, even population that doesn't understand, right? They don't get
Mhm.
it that because they don't know, they haven't heard, or they haven't been educated in that sort of area. And it is so empowering once our children know what it is that they are facing and how they can use their own voice to
Mhm.
advocate for themselves. So I did actually get to witness my son do that because they had put him with a different group of gentlemen to work one day, and they didn't know about his disability. So they were asking him to do some things quickly, and he was really struggling. And he told me then that he said they were really nice, mom. He said, but I had to tell them I have a disability. It's not that I can't learn, it's just that I can't learn that fast. So
Right.
if we can do it slower, I'll get it. But you just have to have a little bit more patience and give me more time. And I was so proud of him for, being able to talk with other people and explain himself a bit more.
I
And
love
it
it.
was, yeah, it was empowering for him. And it was a really happy mommy moment for me. I thought, wow, I was like, okay, he's going to be okay. Because I think
Yep.
one of the biggest fears we have as mothers, as parents, as caregivers is the fact that we try to protect as much as possible, but then it gets to a place where we have to allow our children to kind of go ahead and trust that everything that we have tried to teach them to that point will actually be able to flourish in some way when they need it to, because we can't always be there, right?
Well, that's
So,
right. We're raising adults, right? Even when we start as babies or preschoolers, we're raising adults. Like the ultimate goal is they will be adults someday. We can't stop that from happening. They will leave the nest. They will leave home. We can't stop that from happening, nor would we want to. So we have to be able to give them the tools. Now, the tools are not, just like you said, the tools are not that you will be just like everybody else, or that if you just tried hard enough, you will reach this measuring stick. No, the tools are, in our case, is accommodations and knowledge and a voice, an advocacy voice that says, I love what your son said. I can learn. I just can't learn that fast. So if you take your time and repeat it and give me a chance, I'll learn it. And that's what our kids need. They need to be able to, as my kids are moving into soon into the, working world, we're thinking about what's the right kind of working environment. If it's loud and fast paced, that's not the right kind of working environment. And then also to be able to speak up as they do now, even in school, if they have a new teacher, to say, look, I have a learning disability or I have a brain injury. So, I can't work in this kind of environment, or, I need it quieter, or I need more time. But yeah, like we can't change the whole world, but while they're young and while they're learning, we have to provide a lot of accommodations, just like we do for anybody else who has a disability. If I think about Terry Fox, a wonderful Canadian hero, we celebrate him every September. We celebrate him because he wanted to raise money for cancer research after he had cancer and had his leg amputated. Well, wanting to run across Canada because you've had cancer and you have a leg amputated, you're still not enabled. That might be your dream, but you need a lot more accommodation before that can happen, right? Terry Fox had a whole team of experts around him supporting him. He had a very supportive family willing to adapt and to learn what now their son needed. And he had a prosthetic designed specifically for him. That's exactly what our kids need. They need, a metaphorical prosthesis designed exactly for them to help them to provide the accommodations they need in order to succeed. And so I often think about Terry Fox, and we have a poster of him even in our house, because he was able to realize his dream. He couldn't run across Canada because cancer got him, sadly, but he is forever a Canadian hero because of his spirit and his willingness and his desire to raise awareness. But there was the team supporting Terry, and that's how he could enable his dream. That's the same for you and I. Nobody does this alone. We all have a team. And our kids who have disabilities, particularly invisible disabilities, need a whole network of team around them so they can succeed and realize their dreams.
that's so beautiful. It is so wonderful to hear a fellow parent. And I love that you just called it an invisible disability, because it is. In our case, it's not something that you can see.
Mhm.
physically. And it's wonderful to be able to connect with parents who have children with these types of disabilities, or any disability for that matter, because it's we I feel like, as parents, sometimes we feel like no one understands, or they
Mhm.
won't get it because their children aren't, the same, or their children are, quote quote, what we would call normal. um and I feel like sometimes we isolate ourselves because it is exhausting. I also feel sometimes, trying to explain to everybody what it is that, your children, have, and how it works. And I know that some days I'm just like, I'm overwhelmed because I, like you have 5 children, I have 4 children. So sometimes I feel tired. I feel done.
Absolutely.
Right. And um, I'm so happy that we've connected, because I feel, incredibly supported knowing that I have you out in the world, and that you most likely have similar days to my similar days. Not to say that other parents with children who have no disabilities don't get overwhelmed, but I feel like it's a different sort of overwhelm. Um, Even just in comparing, and my children with disabilities, versus the one who is progressing well and everything is okay. And I feel sometimes even guilt because I don't worry as much for
Yes.
him, you know? And I
Yes.
think to myself, oh man, like, his older brothers get all of this attention, per se.
Yes.
And then, he's kind of like just navigating the world kind of on his own. I'm here, but not in the same context that I'm there for his brothers. So that kind of parent guilt also, brings me down sometimes. And I was like, oh man, I really feel like I need to be paying attention more over here, but he's doing such a good job, right? So I must have done something right if he can navigate up until the 7th grade. He's been doing really well, right?
And that's
Um,
wonderful. And give him that, because if he can, if he's flying on his own, if he's walking, let's go back to the Terry Fox analogy. If he's walking in his own 2 feet, good for him. And it's due to the stable environment and the loving home you've provided him and all the guidance you've provided him. So good for you and good for him. And, but that doesn't, the role is different. Your other children who are differently abled, who have an intellectual disability, they need more assistance. It's just how it is. Just like Terry Fox needed more assistance. He needed a prosthetic leg, and he needed a whole team of medical support around him and social support around him. And Terry Fox has family too. He has brothers, maybe even a sister. I'm not sure, but he has brothers too. And they don't, nobody knows their name, uh, because they're living a different path, right? And your kids have different paths, and you have the distinct pleasure, honor, and frustration of dancing around on both of the, but back and forth on all of these paths. You're trying to encourage all of your children to reach their fullest potential, whatever that might be. But we have to realize that the support of each child is different, as it would be, even if it was a neurotypical family. Families who have no disabilities, still siblings require different things from their parents, and then siblings reach, they have different outcomes, even if they all turn out well. Not everybody's gonna, they're not all gonna have the same career necessary, or all have the same abilities. Some are more intellectual, some are more artsy, and that's okay. And as it is that with your own family, 4 children with 4 distinct paths and 4 distinct outcomes. So I think mothers are too hard on ourselves oftentimes. I think we need to be more gracious with ourselves, and maybe more gracious with our kids as well. But it is exhausting. It is absolute, parenting is exhausting. Parenting any child is challenging work if you're, if you're on it. And it should be, because you're raising a human being, right? And then if the child has more complexities, whether it be medical complexities, mental health challenges, developmental delays, then there's just a whole lot more work on mom and dad to be aware of what this child's needs are, navigating systems of care, including education, medical, mental health, addictions, systems of care. So there's just a lot more on us. And so we are fatigued. And that's where it's really important that parents of typical children, and parents of more complex children, need to take time for self-care. That's really because we have to, just as the flight attendants tell us, we have to put our own oxygen mask first before we put it on our child. And as parents, we always want to put it on our child first because we want to love and protect and take care of our child. But who's there? Who's there for them if we neglect ourselves? So we have to take care of our own spiritual health, mental health, physical health, our relationship health, and our own independence. We have to take care of ourselves so that we can best take care of our children. So self-care is really important when we're raising children with disabilities, because we're raising them for a lot longer. For one thing, it's a lot harder all the way along, and it's a lot longer. Children with intellectual disabilities and children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder will mature at a much slower rate. As I said, the dysmaturity factor is that socially, emotionally, and maybe with some abstractions, children with fetal, or even adults with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder may be that of half their age. So your 19-year-old who's ready to launch in the world, there might be some areas of his development that are maybe half that age. So 19, maybe he's more of a 9 or 10-year-old in some ways. So he's not ready to fly just yet without support. He still needs support and guidance because developmentally, he doesn't have all the skills that a typical 19-year-old has. And that's very true of individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. A 19-year-old with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder will likely have the social skills, how to navigate friendships, how to have safe conversations, what to say, what not to say, how to have a conversation. A 19-year-old might have only the skills of a 6-year-old. 6-year-olds really trust everybody, kind of like anybody who comes on the playground is their new friend. Well, a 19-year-old who adopts that approach is really, anybody who they come across is their friend. A 19-year-old then is very at risk of being victimized,
Right.
and exploited in any number of ways, like taken advantage of advantage of at work, being bullied, being tricked into facilitating, maybe carrying drugs for somebody or selling drugs for somebody, or exploited sexually. Very high risk for people with FASD to be exploited because of the lack of social skill development and cognitive reasoning and the ability to sense risk. And those are all those abstraction and those executive functioning, those parts, the higher level thinking that makes a good adult, being able to navigate the complexities of the world. That's a part of the brain that is forever impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure. And so these individuals, whether they have a mild intellectual disability or individuals who have FASD, are at very high risk of being victimized.
Yes, I completely understand that point, and I do also fear that type of exploitation for my own son because, like you said, he trusts everybody. Everybody is his friend.
Yes.
Where his brother is not as trusting. His brother, on the other hand, doesn't really enjoy being around people he doesn't know. So, I mean, even going to school to him is cause for anxiety, and it's just he doesn't enjoy it at all. And so, even if we ever took him to the park when he was little, if there were people out of our family at the park, that was the end of it. He didn't want to be there. He wanted to go home. He wanted to be safe. And where his older brother, it was the complete opposite. It was like, everybody is my friend at the park. So
yeah, and that's your children, yes, with the intellectual disabilities. That's very much the same with children with FASD, because it's not, a person isn't the disability, and the disability certainly doesn't define or encapsulate the whole person. This is a person with their likes, their interests, their passions, their personality, their temperament, who also has a disability, right? So, I've got children who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and 2 are very, very introverted. The other 2 are extroverted, and one is exceedingly so extroverted, so to anybody, anytime's a good time, and anytime, like, let's play, he's ready to go. Yet in a new environment, he'll be cautious. He'll be a little bit alarmed, perhaps, but that also goes down to his slow cognitive pace and his inability maybe to read a situation. So again, he's still vulnerable. But yeah, we have to be it's important to talk about the disability. It's important to raise awareness of disability, and particularly invisible disabilities, because they're so much more common than people realize. But the person isn't only the disability. That's a component, right? It's a component.
Right.
But there's so much, like I have glasses, I have, vision problems. That's not all of me. I'm also, passionate, friendly, kind,
Mm-hmm.
loving, intelligent, extroverted, friend, ready to lend a helping hand. Like I'm a lot of things. I'm not just a person who wears glasses. And so we have to remember that too for our children. And I
I
just
agree.
mentioned the idea of how common it is. And I just want to share that too with your listeners, because so few people have actually heard about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And why would they? Alcohol is big business, right? Alcohol
Mm-hmm.
advertises to everybody and promises everybody a good time, like you need alcohol to celebrate, you need alcohol to mourn. Like it's, you go to the sports event and there's beer everywhere, like it is very much woven into the fabric of Western culture. But what is also prevalent in Western culture is the damage done to people by alcohol, be it alcoholism, be it, from overindulging or having a dependency on alcohol, and how that ravages families, the destruction to families, the child abuse and the spouse abuse and the domestic violence because of alcohol and overindulgence in alcohol. But also the miscommunication or the lack of awareness that alcohol while pregnant can cause lifelong disability to children. Like so few people know that. Even doctors, medical professionals, when they're coming up in their training, they get a very little bit of information. They do get a little bit of information about fetal alcohol, but it might be an afternoon lecture. It might be a page in a textbook. That's all there
Mm-hmm.
is to something that is actually so common. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is the disability, statistically impacts about 4% of the Canadian population. So that's 1 in 20 people. So if you think around all the
Wow.
20 people, 1 in 20 people are impacted by FASD. Now there's pocket, that's the typical society, right? And that means college educated people, university educated people. I recently learned of a woman who gave birth to a son with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and she was a medical doctor herself. She didn't know the damage she was doing to her baby. And then there's other populations that are at increased risk of having children. So it's everywhere, right? It isn't just, a certain population that has FASD, it's everywhere. And then there are certain populations that have higher rates of FASD, particularly those who already have the disability or those who are already in addiction and then have an unplanned pregnancy and continue to drink because of addiction. Addiction steals your life and it steals your ability to make good decisions. So in those
Mm-hmm.
populations, you'll have a higher rate of FASD. We know of the children, 80% of children born with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is a very complex disability, right? 80% of those children are in foster care. 80% of those children are in foster care or in adoption, be that international adoption or domestic adoption, because those children were born from really hard circumstances in really hard places and generally unplanned pregnancies. So there's a very high rate of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder across Canada. And so it impacts a lot more people than we realize it does. So if you think of your child's classroom, anybody who's listening here, if you've got 30 kids in that classroom, pretty good chance there's a child in there that has fetal alcohol spectrum disorder,
Wow.
and to have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder means that, a diagnostic team has assessed this child, and the whole diagnostic team that looks at their speech, their motor development. Well, first of all, their size, their stature, then their gross motor skills, their fine motor skills, their speech, their cognition, their mental health, their psychology involved. And so they study 10 different brain domains, and you have to have a score of, I think it's a point score, and it has to have the diagnosis of FASD, it has to impact 4 regions of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So think of all those people that have an FASD in it. So that means that the damage has occurred in such a way that it significantly impacts 4 different regions of the brain.
Wow.
What about those who are just under that cusp? They don't have a
Right.
diagnosis of FASD, but they still have a brain injury from prenatal alcohol exposure. So yes, we have a rate of 4% of those diagnosed, or that we can extrapolate out 4%. But what about all those just under that cusp that wouldn't quite qualify for a diagnosis and yet have been impacted by FASD. And maybe these are the kids that look like maybe they have ADHD,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe they have ADHD, or maybe they have a mild cognitive disability. And those doing the assessments never inquired as to, was there prenatal alcohol exposure? Because a lot of clinicians, physicians, psychologists who are doing, or psychiatrists perhaps even, who are doing these examinations don't ask that question. And so a child could end up with learning disability and, multiple diagnoses. They could end up with a diagnosis of learning disabilities, ADHD, mild cognitive impairment, or oppositional defiant disorder, or Tourette's syndrome. And so they could get this whole collection of disabilities. And the one thing that was never asked is, was there prenatal alcohol exposure? Is that actually the overall arching disability under which all these other behavioral descriptors would fit as well, right? And that's not to say that every child who has ADHD actually has FASD. That's not what I'm saying, right? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there are many children who are and adults who are misdiagnosed because that question was never asked.
Exactly. Because it wasn't something that they were prompted to ask. So,
Right.
right. So it's
And
the
women
same.
who have
Mhm.
never heard of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder
Right.
aren't going to volunteer the information because they don't know. They don't know that
Exactly.
maybe that they had some, if they were a casual drinker during pregnancy, that may have actually negatively impacted, or if they were still, if maybe they were kind of like young, they were in university and they were binge drinking. And then once they found out they were pregnant, they stopped binge drinking. Fabulous.
Mhm.
Exactly what we need to do. But what they may not know is that binge drinking may have contributed to the behavior challenges that your child, or the learning challenges your child now has. But unless a physician asks those questions, it's not going to come to light.
Right. It's incredible how sometimes as parents we are not aware of other names or other diagnoses.
Mhm.
So just from my own perspective with my son, they kept saying he had ADHD, and I kept contesting that, and I kept saying no, there's something else. It was the teachers were okay with leaving it at that. It's
Mhm.
ADHD, but I wasn't convinced. I kept saying no, it's something else, but I didn't know what else it could be. I didn't
Yes.
have mild intellectual disability as an option, right? Like it wasn't like they gave me a list of things I could choose from. It was just he has ADHD, but I remember I kept contesting, and man, those teachers did not like me. The administration was like, no, it's ADHD. Take him to a doctor. And I remember doing that. And then the doctor, I remember the first one had seen him for like 10 minutes. And he's like, yeah, he has ADHD. Here's his medication. And I was like, what? No
Yeah.
way. This is so wrong. And
Yeah.
I kept pushing and pushing, and I had been doing that since JK. And
Yeah.
it took up until the 6th grade for them
Yes.
to finally come back and say, well, in addition to ADHD, because they never
Yes.
dropped that one, they
Yeah.
said he has mild intellectual disability. And I thought, which is why I said in a weird way, I was relieved that
Yes.
they finally gave me the name of something else. But at the same time, then I was confronted with that new world of
Mhm.
what the heck is that? Right. So
And it's
I
devastating,
appreciate.
Yeah, even though we pursue that diagnosis because we know there's something more, and we're desperate to find the right answers so that we can best support our kids. We're not looking for labels to limit our children. We're looking for answers so that then we can develop the right accommodations and enable our kids, right? But when you do get that diagnosis of mild intellectual disability, or in our case, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, I anticipated that would be the diagnosis. And when it came, my blood in my body ran cold. I
Mhm.
sat there alone with this whole team, like, I was there by myself with this whole team of experts sitting around this conference table, all telling me about what my kids' strengths are, but what their deficits are. And then it was
Mhm.
like a judge gavel, like, and now I pronounce FASD. And they did it as compassionately as they could. But, that's a lifelong disability.
Right.
Like
Right.
it got real. It got real. And so now, I felt like, so my blood ran cold. and I had to grieve, like that hurt, and grieve for them, for me, for what our dreams were, like just you just grieve, right? But then you afterwards you like, okay, now I have to school up. Now I have to learn everything I possibly can about this, just as I would if it was, let's say it was type 1 diabetes. Okay, I don't know anything
Mm-hmm.
about that either, but I know I
Right.
can learn. And so I didn't know about FASD, but I can learn. And I tried really hard to learn. And fortunately, I found some resources here in Edmonton. Catholic Social Services in Edmonton has FASD support programs, both for people who have FASD. There's separate ones there, and people who are parenting and at risk of having children with FASD. So thank God for those programs, right? There are
Mm-hmm.
supports out there. And there was programs for people like me who are raising children who perhaps have, are suspected of, or who do have FASD, programs to help us as parents. Because like you said, it's so isolating. So I became a part of that program, and they gave me a parent mentor who stayed with me for 18 months and taught me slowly, like what, and helped me do my whole paradigm shift of, okay, because a lot of us go, okay, they have a disability, but they can still do this, or they have a disability, but they
Mm-hmm.
should know better. And no, they have a brain injury. So that means some of these confounding behaviors that we see, like I said, failing in school, or being disruptive, or being having ADHD, like all these disruptive behaviors, instead of taking the typical parenting approach of, well, have a timeout and think about that, or you're grounded because you
Mm-hmm.
did this and that. None of that's going to work if you have a brain injury that doesn't allow you to make connections, right? My
Right.
kids don't learn from that. So instead, I had to do a whole paradigm shift in my parenting. And Catholic Social Services coaching families, it was called FASD coaching families. That program taught me what is FASD, taught me to do what the paradigm shift was and how to do it. So instead of instead of behavior, think brain. And so
Mm-hmm.
taking a whole brain-based approach to child rearing. And it's totally contrary to what typical parents do, and
Mm-hmm.
what you can do when you're raising typical children. Then you can use typical methods, but when you're using children who have challenges, then you have to use exceptional methods, and you have to use different methods that fit right. And
Right.
so I learned about brain-based parenting, and I learned about a book called Trying Differently Rather Than Harder by Diane Malbin. And she explains this disability so very well, and helps parents, really maps out the steps for parents. So yeah, it's really challenging. But I always say the struggle is real, and so is success.
Right.
There's no point staying stuck in the struggle. Then
No.
what you feed grows. If you feed struggle, you're going to get more struggle. But if you have a struggle and you figure out what's the underroot cause, not what's on the surface, but what's the root of that, if that's a brain developmental delay, then what's the bridge of support I can build to cover over those gaps, to teach those life skills, so that my child can cross over and be enabled to do what they need to do, right?
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. So that's what kind of I'm all about, right? And that all started from a passion to build my family through foster care and adoption. I had no
Mhm.
idea that, 25 years later, I'd be sitting here talking to you, Sandy, about raising kids with developmental disabilities and raising kids with fetal alcohol. It all started with a passion to be a mom to children who needed a mom. That's where I started. And I was going to build my family through foster care and adoption. And well, okay, did that, but along the way, I learned a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And that's
And now
incredible.
and now I get to be that friend I wish I had, just like you are that friend
Oh,
that you
that's
wish you
so
had.
sweet.
No, it's
Yes,
true. It's true,
it is. Yeah. It is. It's exactly why the show exists, because there are so many friends I wish I had, going through so many different things, and going through my own addiction, and getting clean 8 years ago. And
Yeah.
that was an isolating journey all in itself, because that fear of judgment, and what if they know who I really
Yes.
am, and doing all of that, and at the same time trying to navigate, having a child with a disability that I had no idea it
Yeah.
was what it was, or and then even that guilt when I found out, and my first thought was, is this my fault? Did I
Yes.
do something to make this happen? Right? So
Yes.
it was awful. And even asking the question out loud back then was scary, because I was like, what if it is my fault? What if it's something I did? Well,
Yep.
I mean, if it was something I did, I didn't do it on purpose, for first of
Exactly.
all, right? But
Exactly.
it's so wonderful to be able to talk to somebody and to hear and to learn about all of these things that we had no idea, because a lot of us as parents, we don't have any idea that this is happening and where to look for help and where to find resources or find the friends that we wish we had in those moments. So I want to make sure that our listeners know where to find you when they need you, because I'm sure you will find many people reaching out for a hand, because it's scary, it's lonely. And I think that if anybody knows two people on this planet who will not judge whatever a
Yes.
label is, and that we are more than happy to assist in any way that we can, we'd be happy to. So I'd love for our friends to know where they can find you when they need you.
Yes, and I am here. I'm available if you need me,
Mhm.
and you can reach out to me on Facebook. It's my name, Robbie Seale, and Sandy will put that all in the show notes, but Robbie Seale on Facebook, and you can send me a message, a messenger, or follow me on Facebook, Robbie Seale on Instagram. And then my podcast is called FASD Family Life, and it's a podcast for families by families raising children and youth with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And it's available everywhere: Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, everywhere that you listen to podcasts, it's available. And, even if you don't, maybe your kid doesn't have FASD, but maybe you're curious, you can still tune in and listen. And you can also email me, you can email me, fasdfamilylife@gmail.com. And I welcome questions from people, or where I will answer questions by email. I'll answer questions on Facebook Messenger, and I'll use those questions on the show too to help other people learn and grow, in their understanding of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder.
Thank you so much for all of this information, Robbie. Is there something you'd like the listeners to walk away with today? If there's one message you wanted to share and make sure that our listeners can keep that with them when they push stop on this podcast today, what would that message be?
I think there's two, Sandy. And the first one is, you're not alone. Whatever your struggle, you're not alone. There is somebody who has walked it, um, and there's somebody who has compassion for you. And perhaps I'm that somebody for you. And the other thing I want you to let you know is, I understand the struggle is real. If you're raising children with a disability, or perhaps you have a disability yourself, and you've been limited by fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or if you're a mom who's thinking, oh my gosh, I think I did drink when I was pregnant, is that why my kid is struggling? I'm here for you. No shame, no blame is really what I go by. And I know the struggle is real, and so is success. That's what I would want to share.
Thank you so much. It's been so wonderful having this talk with you. I feel like we're going to have another talk, because I'm sure we have so many other things that we can discuss and educate our listeners in, as well as just to support each other through life and the unknown of what adulthood is going to be like for our children, but nevertheless knowing that they are going to be completely supported by some of the greatest moms out in the world. So I give you a pat on the back as I give myself a pat on the back,
Yes.
because we know the
Congratulations. Yeah.
struggle is real, like you said, but
But so is success.
exactly. So it's success. Thank you so much, Robbie. I appreciate you, and I can't wait to talk to you again. And I thank you for being the friend I wish I had as well.
My absolute pleasure. And I look forward to talking to you again, Sandy.
Well, that's all for today's episode of The Friend I Wish I Had. Thank you for listening. Please join me again so we can continue to keep each other company. Be sure to subscribe to my podcast, and don't forget to visit my website and get an extra dose of friendship. Talk to you soon. Bye.